January 2024, and it's our first trip of the year. We're off to Norfolk for a week. The incessant rain has caused much flooding across the country, as we can see when we drive across the water meadows on the A34 to the west of Oxford. We take a break at Peterborough. I love cathedral architecture and have visited many of them over the years: Wells, Salisbury, Lincoln, Lichfield, Durham and so on. It's a beautiful building and an almost unspoilt example of Norman architecture from the mid-1100s. There's hardly a pointed arch or lancet window in sight. Even the roof of the nave is painted wood rather than stone vaulted. The exception to this is the beautiful fan vaulting in the retro choir from 1500. I didn't know you were allowed to be tired and emotional in a cathedral. Clyde next the sea was grey and freezing in the bitter northeasterly wind. At the Norfolk Wildlife Trust Reserve, a sparrowhawk was spotted at the edge of the reeds. We saw shelduck, teal and avocet. And lots of widgeon sheltering from the wind. There were a family of hooper swans in residence. A number of brent geese joined in the fun. Clyde is famous for its windmill and is a pretty little village to visit. The next day we visited Blakeney, another pretty village. The sun was out, but it was no warmer in that bitter wind. The main bird we saw was curlew, although we saw one seal way off in the distance, but it was too far to film. We decided to forego the 3-mile slog along the shingle to Blakeney Point to see the seal pups. On Wednesday we headed to RSPB Titchwell, another coastal reserve. Here there were grey plover, red shank, curlew, pintail dabbling and shoveler in the background, and a little egret on the island. Large numbers of brent geese on the lagoon. And a water rail in the ditch. Its favourite ditch apparently. And Gadwall we saw later in the day. There was some beautiful light that day as the sun dipped towards the horizon. Hunstanton, and the colourful cliffs where Fulmers were already setting up residence. Heacham and its beach huts and caravan park on the Wash. Vast swathes of mudflats when the tide is out. The same is true of Snattisham. Where marsh harrier, one of the many we saw during that week, flew overhead. Redshank and oyster catcher ran across the flats. As the tide turned, flocks of knot and oyster catcher gathered together. Along with the Brent geese. Sculthorpe Moor is just a short journey from our base for the week. Owned by the Owl and Hawk Trust, there are 200 acres to explore. There were lots of hides and feeders. Nuthatch, bullfinch and greenfinch, all feeding along with robins, blue and great tits and chaffinch. Tucked away in its box is a tawny owl. In the treetop hide, this table feeder was very popular. Also being visited by a marsh tit and long-tailed tits. This lazy chaffinch is joined by a coal tit briefly. There was still a lot of water about, despite a week's worth of dry weather. Norfolk does have the odd hill fort, despite the lack of hills. This is Warham Hill Fort. Back home in Oxfordshire, you can't throw a brick without beaning a hill fort. Sexbury, Uffington and Liddington on the Downs, and even in the Vale we have camps like Cherbury. Warham sits by the River Stiffkey and was built by the Iceni some 2,200 years ago. Originally the earthworks formed a complete circle, but part of them were levelled in the 1700s when the river was straightened. The still considerable ditches were 2 metres deeper when originally constructed. The site was reused in the Roman period. Recently featured in Series 11 of Digging for Britain, a series of archaeological test pits showed a lot of activity in the late Roman period, including metalworking. Most hill forts in Norfolk have disappeared under the plough or mudflats. This is all that remains of Bloodgate Hill Iron Age fort, built around 2,800 years ago, but flattened in 1827 for ploughing. Wells next the sea. more oyster catchers and curlews, more beach huts, more mud, and a red-breasted merganser. Walsingham was once a major centre for pilgrimage in the medieval period. Creek Abbey was a small Augustinian abbey established around 1206. It thrived for many years until a fire in 1484. The abbey was reduced in size, windows blocked up and so on. Then plague struck shortly after, and the last abbot died alone, reputedly. We had stayed in Fakenham for the week, and we even saw our first snowdrops of the year. Returning home, we went via Welney Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust Reserve. We were greeted by another water rail in the pond and lots of sparrows in the brambles by the feeders. The whole site was flooded, so only one hide was actually open. There were a large number of pochard in front of the hide, along with hooper swans. This scaup was bimbling around amongst the pochard. The strangest sight was this swimming muntjac. Then lastly back to the car to cross the flat lands towards home.